Farmers in the 1950s did put salt down to kill weeds, and it worked and it kept working for years afterward. That is exactly the problem with it. And that is not a warning I'm tacking on at the end. That is the whole video, and I am putting it in the first 30 seconds because there is a version of this going around right now telling people to pour salt water on their garden, and somebody's going to do it and lose that ground for a decade. Salt does not break down. It is not like a spray that degrades in the sun over a few weeks. It is an element. And once it is in your soil, it stays there until enough rain washes it somewhere else. And where it goes is downhill and sideways into whatever you were trying to grow. Now, here is the part that makes this worth 20 minutes of your time. Those farmers were not stupid, and they were not reckless, and they used salt anyway. But they used it in exactly one kind of place for exactly one reason, and everybody understood the rule. That rule got lost, and the salt trick escaped into gardens where it does not belong. I grew up on a place with a salt barrel in the shed, and I can tell you precisely where that salt went and where it never went. And the difference between the two is the difference between a useful old method and ruining your own dirt. By the end of this, you will know the one place salt genuinely belongs and why. You will know why it is banned from anywhere near a garden bed, and it is not the reason you think. You will know what those farmers actually did about weeds in the places that mattered, which was not chemicals and was not salt. And you will know the three things salt can damage that have nothing to do with plants at all, including one that will cost you thousands. Stay with me, because the second part is the method that actually worked. Here is the reframe. Salt is not a herbicide. Salt is a sterilant. A herbicide kills the plants that are there. A sterilant kills the ground. Those are completely different tools with completely different consequences. And the salt trick has been passed around as if it were the first when it is firmly the second. Here is what salt actually does. Plants take up water through their roots by osmosis, which works because the inside of the root is saltier than the soil water outside it. Load that soil water with salt and you flip the gradient. Now the soil is saltier than the root, and water gets pulled out of the plant instead of into it. The weed does not get poisoned. It dies of thirst standing in wet ground. And that is the trouble, because that mechanism does not care what the plant is. It is not selective. It works on the dandelion in the crack, and it works just as well on the tomato 8 feet away, whose roots reach further than you think, and on the maple you like, and on anything that comes up in that spot next spring. Sodium does a second thing on top of that, and this is the part almost nobody knows. It wrecks soil structure. Good soil is made of crumbs, little aggregates with air spaces between them, and that structure is what lets water soak in and roots get through. Sodium breaks those aggregates apart. The clay disperses and the soil goes to a dense, sealed, greasy mess that water runs off instead of into. So you do not just lose the plants, you lose the dirt. A heavily salted patch can stay hostile for years, and it does not simply recover on its own on any time scale that helps you. That is not folklore either. It is why salting the earth is an ancient act of war, and why salt damage along roadsides is a real and studied agricultural problem every winter. And now the thing that makes it worse than a bad choice. Salt moves. It dissolves in the first rain and it goes with the water. Downhill, sideways through the soil, into the bed below, into the roots of a tree, 20 feet away, into the drainage that runs along your fence line. You cannot put salt in one spot and keep it there. You have applied it to a general area whose boundaries you do not control, and will not find out until something dies. So where did the farmer put it? The lane, the gravel yard, the strip along the barn wall, and the cracks in a concrete pad. Places that were never going to grow anything, that nobody wanted anything to grow in, and that were nowhere near the garden or the well. That is the rule, and it is the entire thing. Salt was for ground he had already given up on. Not the fence line where the pasture started, not the edge of the corn, not around the fruit trees, not in the garden, not ever, not in any amount, and the older the farmer, the more certain he was about that. And I want to be honest about something, because I said I would not sell you the old way just for being old. Even in a gravel lane, that salt eventually went somewhere. It went into the ditch, and it went into the field below. Those men were making a trade that they mostly understood and sometimes did not, and modern agronomy would tell you to think harder about it than they did. And it is worth knowing why salt was even to hand, because it explains how it got into the weed business at all. Salt was one of the few things a farm actually bought, and it bought it by the sack. Stock salt for the cattle, a block in every pasture, coarse salt for the ice cream freezer, barrels of it for curing pork every November, 100-pound sack ran a dollar or two in the middle of the 1950s, about the cheapest thing in the building. So there was always salt and there was always more of it than anybody needed that week. Nobody went out and bought salt to kill weeds. Somebody had a lane growing up in grass and a barrel sitting right there and did the obvious thing. That is the entire origin of the trick, and it is why it never came with a warning attached. Nobody thought of it as a product. It was just what was in the shed. I watched what happens when the rule gets broken, and it is the reason I wanted to make this video. Somebody I know poured a strong salt brine along a gravel path that ran beside a raised bed. Weeds gone in 4 days, and he was pleased with himself, and I understand entirely. That autumn, the row of beans nearest the path came up poorly and yellow and stayed short. The following spring, the whole end of that bed was slow, and there was a rosemary at the corner that simply died, and it had been in the ground 6 years. It was not the path. It was everything downhill of the path. 2 seasons later, that end of the bed was still not right, and the only fix was digging soil out and hauling new soil in. That is the number I want you to carry out of this. Not a mixture and not a ratio. 2 seasons, and it had not finished. If this is already making you think about somewhere you have poured something, do me a favor. Hit that like button, subscribe, and turn the notification bell on while you are there. I put out one of these every week. The old practical knowledge that worked for 100 years told honestly, including the parts where the old way was wrong. The bell is the only way these reach you, then stay right here because the next part is the method that actually worked. Here is the second part, and it is what those farmers really did about weeds. They did not kill weeds, they never let them get going. That is the whole difference between the old approach and the modern one, and it is a difference of timing rather than of product. We think about weeds when we can see them, which is already too late. They thought about weeds before there were any. The tool was the hoe, and I want to correct something about how people picture that because it is why nobody does it anymore. Hoeing was not the miserable backbreaking business we imagine. That is chopping at established weeds, which is miserable, and which they were also careful never to have to do. Proper hoeing was a light scuffing pass across the top half-inch of soil with a sharp blade, taking out weeds at the thread stage when they were barely visible. It was fast. A man could scuff a whole row in the time it takes to hack out one thistle. 2 things made it work. The blade was sharp. A hoe was filed like a knife, and a sharp hoe slices through the soil surface and severs seedlings without effort. A dull hoe is a shovel you are dragging, and that is where the misery comes from. Almost every hoe hanging in a shed in this country right now has never been sharpened, and the timing was dry. You hoe on a dry morning with sun coming so the severed seedlings wither on the surface within the hour. Hoe in the wet, and half of them root again, and you have transplanted your own weeds. The rule was that you hoed the row whether you could see anything or not. Every week, on schedule because the whole point was to catch the flush of seedlings before they were tall enough to have a name. There is a phrase that went with this that tells you everything about how they thought. 1 year seeding, 7 years weeding, every grower knew it. It is not poetry, it is an accounting statement, and it explains why a man would walk a clean-looking row with a hoe on a Tuesday for no visible reason. And underneath the hoeing sat the second half of the method, which is the one modern gardens miss most. Do not turn the soil unless you have to. Every square foot of your ground holds an enormous bank of weed seeds, thousands of them, most of them dormant and waiting for light. Deep digging and rototilling brings a fresh layer of that seed bank to the surface and wakes it up. So a person tills to control weeds, gets a flush of new weeds 3 weeks later, tills again and has taught themselves that gardens are simply full of weeds. Shallow disturbance leaves the bank asleep. That is why the scuffing pass works and the rototiller works against you. Then mulch on top of that. Straw, leaves, grass clippings, whatever came free. A few inches of it starves the seeds at the surface of light so they never germinate at all, and it does the other job of holding moisture in your soil. A mulched bed that gets a weekly scuff is very nearly weed-free, and nothing was applied to it. Now let me tell you about the money. Weed control is one of the biggest consumer categories in the whole lawn and garden business, and it runs on the same shape as everything else on this channel. The product treats what you can see in the moment you're annoyed, and it does nothing at all about why the weeds are there. If that landed, hit like and subscribe and ring that bell. And the annual cycle is the business. Spray in spring, spray again in midsummer, spray again in fall, buy again next year. A sharp hoe and a bale of straw would end that, and they are a one-time purchase of almost nothing. I'm not telling you there is a room somewhere where men decided this. There is not. What happened is simpler and worse. It is a quiet agreement among everybody who profits to sell you the cure and never the schedule because a schedule cannot be bottled. Nobody has to coordinate and nobody has to lie. Timing is free and free things do not get advertised, and that is where it has sat for 70 years. And the salt trick is part of the same failure, oddly enough. It circulates now as the natural, free, homemade alternative, and people reach for it precisely because they do not want to buy the bottle. Their instinct is good, the information they were handed is bad. Somebody remembered the salt and forgot the rule that went with it. Now here are the warnings, and this section is the reason this video exists. First, and this is the big one, never put salt anywhere you want anything to grow, now or in the future. Not a garden bed, not a lawn, not a fence line, not under a tree, not on any ground uphill of any of those. Once it is in, you do not get to change your mind. Second, salt will damage a great deal that is not a plant. It corrodes metal, so gates, posts, mower decks, and anything steel nearby will suffer. It attacks concrete, and it particularly attacks the reinforcing steel inside concrete, so salting cracks in a driveway or a patio is buying yourself a bigger repair. And if you have a well, salt moving down through your soil is going toward your drinking water. Third, and this one is expensive, never put salt near a septic system or leach field. Sodium destroys the soil structure, a leach field depends on to work, and a failed field is a very large bill. If you do not know where yours is, find out before you pour anything anywhere. Fourth, the vinegar and salt and dish soap recipe all over the internet. Household vinegar is a weak acid that burns the tops off young weeds and leaves the roots alive, so it looks like it worked for a week. The salt in that recipe does the permanent damage and is the ingredient nobody thinks about, and horticultural vinegar, the strong kind sold at 20 or 30%, is genuinely hazardous and causes chemical burns and permanent eye injury without gloves and goggles. It is not the gentle option people assume. Fifth, boiling water works, and it is genuinely useful for a crack in a path, but carrying a full kettle across a yard is how people get badly scalded. Small amounts, short trips, and never with children or animals underfoot. And the plain one. If you have a serious infestation of something invasive and you are considering strong measures, call your county extension office before you do anything. That service is free, they know your soil and your county, and they will tell you what actually works there. So here is exactly what to do instead, and none of it costs much. Sharpen your hoe. Today, a file, 10 minutes, put an edge on it like a chisel. If you own one tool from this video, that is it, and it will change your opinion of hoeing permanently. Scuff the surface once a week on a dry morning. Half an inch deep, no more, whether you see weeds or not, 5 minutes a bed. Mulch everything 3 or 4 inches, and keep it pulled back an inch or two from stems and trunks so you're not holding damp against them. Stop rototilling if you can. Every deep turn is a fresh crop of weeds you invited up. Never let anything set seed. That is the highest value 5 minutes in the whole garden. One plant going to seed is thousands more next year, and pulling it before it flowers is the cheapest work you will ever do. For paths and gravel and cracks in concrete, use boiling water, a flame weeder if you have one and it is safe where you are, or just pull them. And if you want the permanent answer for a path, put down landscape fabric and gravel on top of it, and stop fighting. And if you have already salted somewhere and regret it, here is your honest position. Time and water are the only fix. Heavy rain or deliberate deep irrigation will eventually leach the sodium down and out. Gypsum can help displace it in some soils, and adding organic matter helps rebuild the structure. But it is slow, it is measured in seasons, and in a small raised bed, the real answer is often to take the soil out and start again. One more thing, because it is the part I actually think about. That barrel of salt in the shed was not a garden product. It was for the stock mostly, and for the ice cream freezer in July, and for curing. The bit that went on the lane was an afterthought, a scoop out of something that was already there for 6 other reasons, and that is how nearly everything on that farm worked. Nothing was bought for one job. A thing arrived for one purpose, and then it got used for whatever else it happened to suit, and the knowing was in the limits. Everybody understood what each thing was good for, and just as importantly, where it must not go. That second half is what we lost. We kept the tips and threw away the boundaries. Salt on the lane came down to us. Not in the garden did not, and that is true of most of what circulates now as old wisdom. Every one of these methods came off a working farm, where somebody knew the whole of it, the use and the limit together, because they lived with the consequences of getting it wrong. What travels to us is the half that makes a good sentence. I asked my grandfather once why he would not put salt along the fence row where the weeds were worst. He said the fence row was still ground. He said you can be careless with a gravel lane because the lane is already dead, but he was not going to kill anything on purpose that was still alive and might be needed. If you have gotten this far with me, hit like, subscribe, and turn on that bell. Nobody sponsors a video that says the answer is a file and a bale of straw, so the only thing keeping this in front of people is you. You did not forget this. Nobody taught you, and then you forgot. It was taken from you one bottle at a time and then handed back to you in pieces on the internet with the method still attached and the rules stripped off, which is worse than losing it altogether. So do one thing this week. Go and find your hoe and put a file to it, and then take one pass down a row on a dry morning and see how little effort it actually is. Then tell me in the comments what you found, what county you're in, and whether anybody in your family kept a salt barrel and what else it got used for, because I read everyone, and those stories are the reason I keep recording. And if this rang true to you, come back for the next one, because I am going to show you how she kept butter sweet and spreadable on the counter through the whole summer with no ice and no refrigerator, using a crock, cold water, and one thing about the lid that almost nobody gets right. Nobody sells it, so nobody teaches it. I will. Keep it simple, keep it yours. And remember, the people who knew exactly where a thing belonged and exactly where it did not new things, we are only starting to remember.